There is a particular kind of audacity that stops an entire sport in its tracks. Not the audacity of a great play. Not the audacity of a championship moment or a record-breaking performance. Those kinds of audacity are celebrated, they are what the sport exists to produce. The kind of audacity that stopped baseball cold in the hours following Bryce Elder's press conference is a different species entirely. It is the audacity of a man who committed 2 deliberate fouls against the most watched player in the sport, got caught on camera doing it, faced an emergency investigation from the umpiring crew, and then, rather than accepting the consequences that everyone watching knew were coming, stood in front of the media and told Shohei Ohtani to stop pretending to be innocent. The room went quiet when those words landed. Not the polite quiet of a press conference between questions. The specific, loaded quiet of people processing something they cannot immediately believe they heard. Elder had fouled Ohtani twice. The evidence was clear. The investigation was already underway. And his response, his chosen strategy in a moment that called for accountability, was to shift the blame. To insult the victim. To look directly into the cameras and reframe the story in a way that positioned Ohtani not as the player who had been wronged, but as the player manufacturing victimhood for his own benefit. It was a gamble of stunning proportions. And within hours, it collapsed completely, because Elder did what almost nobody predicted he would do after spending an entire press conference denying responsibility. He admitted everything. The admission did not close the story. It opened it wider. Because now the question was not whether the fouls happened. Everyone already knew they happened. The question was why a player would commit them, deny them publicly with maximum aggression, insult the player he had wronged, and then reverse course completely, all within the same news cycle. That question does not have a comfortable answer. Before this series, Bryce Elder existed in the specific category of baseball player that the sport produces in abundance, genuinely talented, organizationally valued, known within the baseball community but not yet carrying the kind of name recognition that crosses over into the broader cultural conversation. He is a pitcher with real ability. His stuff is legitimate. His track record inside the Atlanta organization reflects a player who has earned his place on a roster built around winning. None of that is in question and none of it is irrelevant, because understanding who Elder is before this moment makes what he did during it more comprehensible, even if it remains indefensible. Pitchers who face Ohtani carry a specific psychological burden that is unlike anything else in the sport. The preparation is more intense. The analytical pressure is greater. The margin for error feels smaller because the consequences of a mistake, a home run from Ohtani in a critical situation, are disproportionately visible. The whole world is watching when Ohtani steps in. And the whole world notices when a pitcher fails to stop him. Elder had been pitching against that pressure. And somewhere inside that pressure, in the specific frustration of facing a hitter who refuses to be solved by conventional means, something crossed a line. The first foul was borderline enough that it could be argued. The second one eliminated any argument. 2 deliberate fouls, in sequence, targeting Ohtani specifically, with an intent that the camera angles documented with uncomfortable clarity. The umpiring crew did not wait. The investigation was immediate. In professional baseball, the standard process for reviewing potential rule violations moves through established channels. Reports are filed. Video is reviewed. Determinations are made through a process that prioritizes accuracy over speed. When an investigation is described as emergency, when the umpiring crew initiates review with the urgency that characterized the response to Elder's fouls, it communicates something specific about the severity of what was observed. Emergency investigations happen when what occurred on the field is clear enough that waiting for the standard process feels inadequate. They happen when the incident in question involves a player of sufficient prominence that the league's response time itself becomes part of the story. And they happen when the evidence is strong enough that the investigative process is less about determining what happened and more about documenting it formally before the public narrative gets too far ahead of the official record. All 3 conditions applied here. The footage of both fouls was unambiguous. The targeting of Ohtani was not a matter of interpretation, it was a matter of watching what happened and describing it accurately. The umpiring crew, fully aware of what the cameras had captured and what the league would face if its response was slow, moved with a speed that reflected the seriousness of the situation. Elder was informed of the investigation before the game had fully concluded. And his response to that information, the response he chose to take public, was the decision that transformed a serious incident into something historic. There is a strategic logic, however flawed, behind what Elder attempted to do. When you are facing documented evidence of wrongdoing, one available path is full denial combined with aggressive counternarrative. You reframe the story. You make the person pressing the claim the subject of scrutiny rather than yourself. You use language designed to undermine the credibility of the person you wronged, to make their legitimate grievance look like performance, like manipulation, like the calculated move of someone working the situation for personal benefit. Elder used every element of this strategy. He was not subtle about it. Telling Ohtani to stop pretending to be innocent was not an accidental choice of words. It was a deliberate attempt to recast Ohtani, the player who had been fouled twice, whose only visible response had been composed professionalism, as a manipulator. As someone manufacturing victimhood. As a star player using his status to make a story out of something that didn't deserve one. The problem with this strategy, in Elder's specific situation, was the evidence. You cannot tell a man to stop pretending to be innocent when the camera footage of what you did to him has already been viewed by the investigative crew, by both organizations, and by the broader baseball media. You cannot reframe a story that the visual record has already told with complete clarity. And you cannot attack the credibility of a player whose public conduct, composed, professional, silent in the face of provocation, has provided exactly zero ammunition for the attack you are attempting to make. The press conference did not shift the narrative. It accelerated the collapse of Elder's position. Because the moment his words reached the people who had already seen the footage, the question was no longer about the fouls. The question became about the character of the person who committed them, and then described the victim as a pretender. Shohei Ohtani said nothing. This is, by now, the most predictable and most powerful thing that can be said about how Ohtani responds to controversy directed at him. He does not engage. He does not retaliate through the media. He does not provide the reaction that the people who provoke him are hoping to produce. He returns to work. But the absence of a verbal response should not be mistaken for the absence of a message. Because Ohtani's silence in the face of Elder's accusations communicated something to everyone watching that no statement could have matched. Composure, maintained under public insult, from a player who had been physically fouled twice and then blamed for it, is not passivity. It is a demonstration of the specific mental strength that separates players who are great from players who are historic. The ability to absorb provocation, deliberate, public, personal provocation, without letting it alter your standard or your routine or your focus is not a minor character detail. It is the defining characteristic of a champion. Elder called Ohtani a pretender. Ohtani responded by being exactly who he always is. The contrast required no commentary. Then Elder admitted it. The timing made the admission worse than the original offense in a very specific way. If Elder had come forward immediately, if the press conference had been an acknowledgement of what happened rather than a denial, the story would have been significant but manageable. A player who commits fouls and takes responsibility enters a different conversation than a player who commits fouls, publicly insults the person he wronged, and then reverses course when the weight of the evidence makes continuation of the denial impossible. The admission confirmed what the footage showed. But it also confirmed something about Elder's judgment, about the decision-making process of a player who chose aggression and deflection over accountability, held that position publicly, and then abandoned it. Inside the Braves organization, the admission created a problem that extends beyond the disciplinary process. Team cultures are built on the specific trust that players have in each other's integrity. When a player commits fouls against the most scrutinized player in the sport, handles the aftermath with a public blame shift that makes the entire organization look defensive, and then admits the truth only after the denial becomes completely untenable. That sequence of events leaves marks. Not just in the media. In the locker room. In the conversations that happen away from cameras, between players who are processing what it means to be represented by that choice. The umpiring crew's emergency investigation produced findings that the league now has to act on. The disciplinary process, for a confirmed case of deliberate fouls against a player of Ohtani's status, will not be quiet. The suspension discussions being held internally will reflect both the seriousness of what Elder did on the field and the seriousness of what he chose to do publicly afterward. Because the league is not just adjudicating the fouls. It is adjudicating the response to the fouls, the public insult directed at the victim, the attempt to use a media platform to undermine the integrity of the investigation while it was actively underway, and the admission that followed only when that attempt failed completely. That full sequence carries weight that a straightforward disciplinary case does not. And the penalty, when it arrives, will communicate to every player in the sport what the standard is when conduct like Elder's enters the public record. Bryce Elder walked into that press conference believing that the story could be rewritten. That the right combination of words, delivered with enough confidence, could shift the weight of documented evidence onto the shoulders of the player who had been wronged. He was wrong about all of it. The footage did not change. The investigation did not pause. The credibility of the man he called a pretender did not waver. And when the denial became impossible to maintain, the admission that followed did not restore what had been lost, it simply confirmed that everything the footage had shown was exactly what it looked like. Shohei Ohtani never said a word. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke. The investigation spoke. And in the end, Bryce Elder himself spoke, saying, in the admission he never wanted to make, everything that the footage had already said for him. Some stories write themselves. This one was written the moment Elder decided that audacity was a better strategy than truth. It wasn't.